Excerpts from the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills Workbook, written by Matthew McKay, PH.D., Jeffrey C. Woods, PSY.D., and Jeffrey Brantley, M.D. The cost of self-destructive coping strategies. Number 1, if you have self-destructive coping strategies, you spend a great deal of time thinking about the past pain, mistakes, and problems. Number 2, you get anxious worrying about possible future pain, mistakes, and problems. Number 3, you isolate yourself to avoid possible pain. Number 4, you use alcohol or drugs to numb yourself. Number 5, you take your painful feelings out on others. And number 6, you engage in dangerous behaviors like cutting, pulling out hair, and self-mutilation. Now we're going to continue, but I want to share some of the costs of these self-destructive coping strategies. So with the first one, because you're spending so much time thinking about past pain, mistakes, and problems, you could miss out on good things that might be happening right now in the present. And regret missing those things can create depression later. It also keeps you fixated on the past, which can lock you into depression or anxiety. Number 2, because you get anxious worrying about possible future pain, mistakes, and problems, again, you miss out on the good things that might be happening now. And you stay stuck in anxiety about the future instead of conceptualizing the future as something really wonderful and possibly very positive. Number 3, because you're isolating to avoid possible pain, you spend more time alone, and as the result, you feel even more depressed. Number 4, because you're using alcohol and drugs to numb yourself, you're creating a cycle of addiction. There's loss of money. You might have problems at work. You might incur legal problems, relationship problems, and eventually health consequences. Number 5, because you're taking your painful feelings out on others, you experience a loss of friendships, problems in romantic relationships, problems with family members. Other people may start to avoid you. You might create loneliness for yourself. You may eventually feel bad about hurting other people. There could also be legal consequences for your actions and other social problems. And if you're engaging in dangerous behaviors like cutting, pulling out your hair, self-mutilation, well, you're really creating physical pain for yourself, infection, scarring, disfigurement, emotional shame, and maybe even the potential for death. Now let's look at some other ways that people sometimes cope in a negative or self-destructive way. You may engage in unsafe sexual activity like unprotected sex or frequent sex with strangers. You may avoid dealing with the causes of your problems. You may eat way too much or restrict what you're eating or throw up after you eat. You may have attempted suicide or engaged in other nearly fatal activities, risk-taking behavior. You may avoid pleasant activities like social events and exercise. And you may surrender to your pain and live an unfulfilling life. So what are the consequences of these self-destructive behaviors? If you're engaging in unsafe sexual activities, unprotected sex with frequent strangers, obviously there could be sexually transmitted diseases. Some of those can be life-threatening. There can be pregnancy, shame, or embarrassment. I remember working with a client many years ago. He had HIV. He had about 5 kids, 5 or 6 children, and several grandchildren. The reason we started working together was because of his cocaine habit. But in working with him to alleviate the substance abuse, he confided in me that he had HIV. He was positive, and he began to talk about the numerous sexual partners he'd had, during his substance abuse escapades. There was so much shame about having HIV. He didn't want to let his family know that he was sick and that he was dying. He was happier letting them know that he had a coke problem that he was trying to address, but he didn't want them to know that he was so sick that he might actually die at some point. Very sad. If we look at avoiding dealing with the causes of problems, well, what that does is it sets us up to put up with destructive relationships. We can find ourselves getting burned out doing things for other people. And if we don't get any of our own needs met, eventually we'll just experience depression. If we avoid dealing with the causes of our problems, it causes us to live a more inauthentic life, which prevents us from having more meaningful relationships. If the problem is eating way too much or restricting what we eat or throwing up what we eat, and I mean intentionally throwing up after eating, not something that's happening involuntarily because you're ill. Well, the consequences are weight gain if we eat way too much, if we use food as a coping skill or a weapon against ourselves. Then, of course, there's anorexia and bulimia. And then there's health consequences if we are overeating, undereating, restricting our food. There may be medical treatment that previously wasn't required, but now it's forced because of our eating habits. And then there are emotional experiences, embarrassment, shame, depression. Now, when we look at eating disorders, anorexia, or bulimia, there's so much of that. It's a physical condition, but so much of it is emotionally based. And it's interesting when I work with clients with these disorders. And I also notice that when people cut themselves, people cut for different reasons, and people restrict their eating for different reasons, and people overeat for different reasons. It's not like there's just some one universal reason that everybody engages in the behaviors that they engage in. Everybody's different. For some people, it's about control. For some people, it's about self-punishment. For some people, it is a way to keep others away, from harming them if there's been trauma. Restricting your eating or overeating is a way to maybe keep predators away. There's so many different reasons why people self-harm, whether it's cutting or overeating, restricting their eating. But what we found is that it's always emotionally based. There's always some trigger that occurred, emotionally as the result usually of trauma. And now these coping skills or self-destructive patterns have now been activated. If you've attempted suicide or engaged in other high-risk or nearly fatal activities, well, obviously hospitalization is going to be an issue, possible long-term medical complications, embarrassment, shame, depression, trauma to family members, children, parents, loved ones, significant others, romantic partners, and of course, the potential for death. If you find yourself avoiding pleasant activities like social events and exercises, then the consequence is preventing self from enjoyment. Lack of exercise can lead to depression, stagnant energy in the body, physical pain, lack of flexibility. It contributes to shame and isolation. And then if we just surrender to pain and just accept the fact that life is going to be misery, that we're going to live an unfulfilling life, and that's just the way that it is. Well, gosh, that sure creates so much pain and distress, regrets about our life, and cycles within cycles within cycles of depression. The cost of self-destructive coping strategies are clear. All of them lead to pain being prolonged in a long-term sense. We basically create long-term suffering. Sometimes pain can't be avoided, but a lot of the times it can. And if we exercise the courage to self-regulate and create healthier choices, we can often pull ourselves out of dark holes, even when we don't see the light in the moment. To avoid long-term suffering, we're going to have to learn self-regulation skills and distress tolerance skills. These skills will help us to endure and cope with emotional pain in a new way, a healthier way, so that it doesn't lead to long-term suffering. When we learn distress tolerance skills, one of the very first things we learn to do is to distract ourselves from situations that are causing emotional pain. Now, there's different philosophies about distraction. There are some philosophies that I'm actually reading a book right now that is rooted in Buddhist philosophy, and it is strongly discouraging distraction. It is actually encouraging being fully present even in the pain. And actually not necessarily looking for babysitters or Band-Aids. And I think there's a lot of relevance in this literature, this philosophy. I'm enjoying it. I don't necessarily agree completely with that, because I work with patients who, I think it's baby steps, right? I think it has a lot to do with where we are in our spiritual consciousness and enlightenment, and giving ourselves permission to tolerate distress, and being able to hold the polarities of emotion, like being able to hold depression and anxiety and a feeling of worthlessness, and yet at the same time knowing that you do have worth, and that these are just stories you're telling yourself, and that you will get out of the hole. That's a beautiful evolved consciousness, and it's resilience, but not everybody's there. There are people who, once they feel worthless, they're just going to spiral down unless there's some type of intervention to help pull them out. A lot of the time, people really do need hope. They need inspiration. And quite frankly, I believe sometimes people just need energy clearing. Sometimes the energetic interference needs to be removed. The obstacle needs to be removed so that the individual can tap into their resilience and activate that inner fight, to want to live. So, according to the book, this particular book that I'm pulling excerpts from, and also my own ideas about self-regulation and emotional management, distraction skills are important because, number one, they can temporarily stop you from thinking about your pain. And number two, as the result, they give you time to find an appropriate coping response. However, we don't want to confuse distraction with avoidance. When you avoid a distressing situation, you're choosing not to deal with it. But when you distract yourself from a distressing situation, you do intend to deal with it in the future when your emotions have stabilized, when you've calmed down, and you have reached a tolerance level that will allow you to be proactive and strategic about what the experience is. Many people with overwhelming emotions, such as panic, when faced with an argument, rejection, failure, or some other type of painful event, they just become completely overwhelmed. So it's often necessary for us to soothe ourselves. We have to learn to self-soothe and alleviate distress before our emotions become too hot. We can address, problems so much better if we've already learned to self-soothe, if we've already learned to some degree to self-regulate. And this is where breathing is so helpful. All of the different breaths that I talk about in my attunement folders on the Empath Heart Healing YouTube, or if you've ever done a meditation with me or a relaxation technique with me or a progressive muscle relaxation technique, there's so much breath, and it's oxygenating the brain, it's oxygenating the bones and the blood, and it's syncing the right and left brain hemispheres and syncing the brain with the body, and the breath just feels delicious and luscious and wonderful. We can start off feeling extremely anxious and really calm ourselves in just a few moments, a few seconds, when we're breathing properly. Diaphragmatic breath is so helpful for clearing the stagnant breath that gets trapped underneath the lungs, and really just oxygenating the brain so that we can activate proper decision making, which is going to help us pull ourselves out of the hole. So self-soothing is meant to bring you some amount of peace and relief from your pain so that you can figure out what your next move is going to be, so you can figure out what your next step is going to be. Let's take a nice deep breath in through the nose and out through the nose. Relax the shoulders down away from the ears. And let's breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Lengthen and deepen the breath with no stress or pressure. Just let it happen gently. Widen and expand the breath. No force. We're just staying present, oxygenating the brain, syncing the brain with the body. And then in through the nose and out through the mouth, sighing out on the exhale, really making the sound of a sigh. Do that 2 more times, inhaling in through the nose, exhaling through the mouth, sighing out. One more. Giving yourself permission to self-soothe while your brain accepts the challenge to self-regulate with healthier coping skills.